On the cold morning of November 14, 1987, frost still clung to the fence posts outside Adair County, Iowa, when 26-year-old Ethan Walker climbed down from a faded 1952 Farmall M. The tractor had spent 35 years pulling plows across the same black soil, its four-cylinder engine rumbling with the calm confidence of something built before shortcuts became fashionable. Ethan rested his left hand on the warm cast-iron hood while staring across 160 acres his family had worked since 1941. The fields looked peaceful. The men driving toward him did not. 3 black sedans rolled through the farm gate without slowing. Dust rose behind them. The engines stopped. 4 men stepped out. All wore polished boots that had never sunk into spring mud. The 5th man unfolded a leather folder. "Mr. Walker," he said, "you have until noon to sign." Ethan never reached for the papers. Instead, he looked past them toward the farmhouse porch where his 74-year-old father, Samuel Walker, sat quietly in a weathered oak rocker, watching everything without saying a word. Samuel had seen drought. He had survived collapsing corn prices. He had buried his wife. He had never hurried a single decision. Neither had his son. The spokesman smiled. "I think you misunderstand." "I don't," Ethan answered. "The bank now owns this land." "No," Ethan replied softly. "The bank believes it does." The wind carried the smell of frozen corn stalks across the yard. Nobody moved. Then the spokesman snapped the folder shut. "We'll be back." They climbed into their cars and disappeared down the gravel road, leaving only tire tracks behind. Samuel finally stood. His hands were rough enough to tell 50 years of farming without speaking. "Coffee?" he asked. Ethan nodded. Nothing more needed saying. Because both men understood something the visitors did not. The fight had already begun. Let me tell you about Samuel Walker. He bought his first 40 acres in May 1946, just months after returning from Europe. He never talked much about the war. If someone asked, he'd simply point toward the fields and say, "This is where I wanted to end up." Over 41 years, he expanded the farm piece by piece until it reached 160 acres. He never borrowed more than necessary. He repaired everything himself. Fence wire, harvest wagons, grain bins, engines. People joked that if Samuel ever found Noah's Ark buried beneath his pasture, he'd have it floating by Saturday afternoon. His favorite possession wasn't the farmhouse. It wasn't the land. It was the old Farmall M sitting inside the machine shed. Purchased new in March 1952 from Miller Implement Company in Greenfield for $2,640, the tractor produced nearly 38 drawbar horsepower. It weighed just over 5,500 pounds, burned gasoline with surprising thrift, and pulled a 3-bottom plow through Iowa clay without complaint. Samuel changed the oil every 100 hours, greased every fitting, stored it indoors every winter. The original owner's manual still rested in a wooden drawer wrapped inside wax paper. To outsiders, it looked like an old tractor. To Samuel, it carried every memory he refused to lose. Now Ethan cared for it exactly the same way. The trouble had started 6 months earlier. In May 1987, another bank purchased the struggling local lender that held Walker Farm's operating loan. The old manager retired. The new manager arrived. His name was Richard Holloway, 38 years old. Business degree from Chicago. Perfect suit. Perfect smile. Perfect confidence. He believed farming should be managed from spreadsheets. Samuel believed crops ignored spreadsheets. Their first meeting lasted 14 minutes. Holloway suggested selling older machinery and leasing newer equipment. Samuel quietly declined. Holloway recommended expanding debt to increase productivity. Samuel declined again. The banker laughed politely. "You can't farm like it's still 1952. Samuel smiled. "No. We farm because 1952 still works." Holloway left convinced the old man simply feared change. He never realized Samuel understood debt better than most bankers. Harvest finished late that October. Corn prices stayed low. Interest rates remained painful. The Walkers requested another extension. Instead, Holloway demanded immediate repayment. The amount wasn't enormous. $61,480. Enough to threaten the farm. Not enough to justify panic. Samuel wasn't worried. Something in the paperwork bothered him. He spent evenings reading every page, every receipt, every renewal, every mortgage record dating back decades. Sometimes until midnight. Sometimes longer. He kept saying the same sentence. They're counting something twice. Ethan trusted him. If Samuel said there was an error, there was an error. Have you ever watched someone remain perfectly calm while everyone else insisted disaster was unavoidable? It's unsettling, because calm confidence usually comes from experience, not luck. And experience often sees what panic cannot. 3 mornings later, Ethan drove the Farmall into town for fuel. Farmers gathered outside Cooper's feed store like they always did. Coffee cups, seed catalogs, weather talk. The moment Ethan stepped inside, conversation stopped. News traveled fast in farm country. Everyone knew the bank planned foreclosure. Nobody knew why. Across the room stood Richard Holloway. He smiled broadly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, "here comes the young man trying to save a 160-acre farm with a tractor older than television." Several people chuckled. 1 laugh became 5. Then 10. The sound filled the store. Holloway shook his head. "Maybe if that museum piece could print money, you'd have a chance." More laughter. Even the cashier looked uncomfortable. Every eye turned toward Ethan. He could have argued, could have shouted, could have cursed. Instead, he set 2 cans of engine oil on the counter, paid exactly $9.84, picked them up, then looked directly at Holloway. "My father always told me something." "And what's that?" Holloway asked. The loudest man in the room usually hasn't finished reading. Silence replaced laughter. Ethan tipped his cap, walked outside, started the Farmall. Its deep engine note echoed through the parking lot. Nobody laughed after that. Not because they suddenly believed him. Because they couldn't explain why he seemed so certain. That afternoon the 5 men returned. Only this time they didn't come with paperwork. They came with urgency. "We're done negotiating," the spokesman said. "Sign." Ethan refused again. One of the men grabbed his wrist. Another forced a pen into his hand. The document fluttered in the November wind. Samuel stepped off the porch. Slowly, calmly. His boots crunched across frozen gravel. He was still 20 feet away when the spokesman gave an order no one else on that farm would ever forget. "Make him sign." The words landed harder than a hammer. 2 men pinned Ethan's shoulders against the side of the pickup. Another twisted his right arm toward the foreclosure papers spread across the hood. The spokesman held out a fountain pen. "1 signature," he said. "Then we all go home." Ethan looked at the paper, then at the farmhouse, then at his father. Finally, he let the pen fall into the gravel. "I won't sign." The spokesman's patience disappeared. One of the men grabbed Ethan's hand and squeezed it against the steel hood with enough force to make him cry out. Another forced his fingers backward, trying to make him lose his grip and comply. The pain was immediate, sharp, and overwhelming. Samuel's voice finally broke the silence. "That's enough." He never shouted. He didn't need to. The 5 men turned toward the elderly farmer. Samuel stopped a few yards away, his weathered hands hanging calmly at his sides. "I've worked this ground for 41 years, he said. "I've buried my wife on the hill behind that oak tree. I've paid every honest debt I've ever owed. If your bank believes hurting my son changes the truth written on those papers, then your bank understands neither farming nor truth." For just a moment, nobody moved. The spokesman nodded toward his men. They released Ethan with a rough shove. His right hand trembled badly. The fingers were badly bruised and swollen, making it impossible to close his fist, but he remained standing. The spokesman straightened his coat. "You have 48 hours." Then the black sedans disappeared once again down the county road. The local doctor in Greenfield examined Ethan that afternoon. "No fractures," he said after carefully wrapping the injured hand. But the ligaments have taken a beating. You stay away from heavy work for several weeks." Ethan almost laughed. "Corn doesn't wait several weeks." The doctor smiled sadly. "I figured you'd say that." Back at the farm, Samuel placed the foreclosure papers on the kitchen table beside 3 wooden boxes filled with receipts dating back decades. Every canceled check, every loan renewal, every tax payment, every equipment invoice. Nothing had ever been thrown away. Samuel poured 2 cups of coffee. "They made one mistake." Ethan flexed his bandaged hand. "The paperwork?" Samuel nodded. "No. The assumption. Let me tell you about county farmers in Iowa during the late 1980s. People often imagine neighboring farms as competitors. Sometimes they were. But when disaster arrived, fences became almost invisible. One family might own the combine. Another owned the grain truck. Someone else had the hay baler. During harvest, equipment crossed property lines almost daily. If a barn burned, neighbors rebuilt it. If illness struck, neighbors harvested fields without sending invoices. The bank understood interest rates. Farmers understood each other. That difference mattered more than anyone inside a city office could calculate. 2 days later, Samuel and Ethan drove the old Farmall M to the county recorder's office. The tractor drew smiles from everyone they passed. Inside the courthouse, an elderly clerk named Martha Jensen recognized Samuel immediately. "You still keeping that Farmall running?" Samuel smiled. "It still starts every morning." "So do you." She spent nearly an hour helping them search mortgage records. Dust floated through shafts of afternoon sunlight as thick leather books were carried onto long oak tables. Page after page revealed transfers, renewals, assignments, signatures. Then Samuel stopped turning pages. "There." Martha adjusted her glasses. "I don't believe it." Neither did Ethan. One document from August 1981 showed the original operating loan had been fully renewed. Another document filed months later listed the same balance again under a different reference number. The debt appeared twice. Exactly as Samuel suspected. If the duplicate remained, the bank's demand looked legal. If removed, everything changed. Martha leaned back. "You'll want an attorney." Samuel quietly folded the copies. "No, not yet." That evening Richard Holloway hosted a meeting inside the bank conference room. County officials, loan officers, several large land investors. Everyone expected Walker Farm to become available before winter. Holloway pointed confidently toward a map. "Excellent ground. Prime drainage. Strong resale value." One investor asked, "Any resistance?" Holloway laughed. "From an old man and his son with a 70-year-old tractor?" The room chuckled. "They'll sign. What if they don't? They don't have another option." He believed every word. Have you ever watched someone underestimate another person simply because they looked ordinary? Maybe it was someone wearing worn-out boots. Maybe it was someone who spoke quietly while everyone else competed to sound important. Sometimes the strongest position belongs to the person who has no interest in winning the argument, only in protecting what matters. The next morning, Ethan tried climbing onto the Farmall despite his injured hand. Samuel stopped him. "You'll make it worse. Cattle still need feed." "I know. I can drive." "I know. I won't let this farm stop." Samuel rested a hand on his son's shoulder. "It won't." For the first time since the confrontation, Ethan saw moisture gathering in his father's eyes. Not fear. Pride. "Let me tell you about that old Farmall M one more time. People often think horsepower tells the whole story. It doesn't. Horsepower measures how quickly an engine can do work. Torque measures the twisting force that actually gets heavy loads moving. Old tractors like the Farmall M produced strong, steady torque at low engine speeds. They weren't fast, and they weren't flashy, but they could pull stubborn loads hour after hour without straining every component. That's one reason so many remained dependable decades after newer machines came and went. Farmers trusted them because they delivered their strength patiently, not dramatically. Samuel loved explaining that. "Anybody can make something fast," he'd say. It takes real engineering to make something dependable. Late that afternoon, a dusty red pickup rolled into the Walker driveway. Then another. Then another. None of them had been invited. Old friends climbed out. Neighbors. Cousins. Farm families from across Adair County. Nobody asked questions. Nobody demanded explanations. One man simply carried 2 sacks of cattle feed into the barn. Another repaired a broken gate. A third began servicing the grain dryer. Within an hour, the farm was alive with quiet work. Samuel watched from the porch. Ethan stood beside him, still unable to fully use his injured hand. "Did you call them?" Ethan asked. Samuel smiled. "No." "Then how did they know?" Samuel looked across the fields where truck after truck continued arriving. "In farm country," he said softly, "news travels faster than radio." As the November sun disappeared below the horizon, headlights appeared on every road leading toward the Walker farm. There were far more than either of them expected. And at the front of the growing line stood a man Ethan never imagined he would see. The first pickup rolled into the yard just after sunrise on November 19th, 1987. Behind it came another. Then another. Within 20 minutes, the gravel road leading to the Walker farm looked less like a country lane and more like the entrance to the Iowa State Fair. Red pickups. Green tractors. Blue grain trucks. Weathered flatbeds. Even a few horses pulling wagons from nearby Amish families. Ethan stood on the porch beside Samuel, his bandaged right hand resting inside his coat pocket. He counted quietly. 23. 37. 51. The line kept growing. By 8 o'clock, 90 neighboring farmers had arrived. Some had driven 5 miles. Others nearly 40. None of them had been asked. They simply came. Samuel removed his cap. For a long moment, he couldn't speak. The first man to step forward was Harold Benson, 70 years old, whose family had farmed nearby since before the First World War. He carried a weathered cigar box. Without saying a word, he placed it on the porch railing. Samuel opened it. Inside lay neatly folded bills. Mostly 20s. Some 10s. A few 5s. Years of careful savings. Harold looked Ethan straight in the eye. "This isn't charity. It's an investment." "In what?" Harold smiled. "In making sure good people don't disappear." One by one, more farmers stepped forward. One woman handed Samuel an envelope. Another family offered enough diesel fuel to finish the season. A mechanic volunteered to repair every machine on the property without charging $1. A veterinarian promised free livestock care until spring. Someone unloaded 50 square bales of hay. Another delivered seed corn already paid for. Nobody kept records. Nobody expected repayment. Because every person standing there understood something no bank ledger ever could. A farm wasn't simply land. It was memory. It was family. It was every sunrise that came before. Let me tell you about rural trust. In cities, trust is often written into contracts. On farms, it is written into seasons. You remember who helped pull your combine from the mud during harvest. You remember who milked your cows while you buried your father. You remember who arrived with casseroles after your barn burned. Those debts rarely appear on paper. Yet they are often stronger than mortgages worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Samuel had spent 40 years quietly paying those invisible debts. Now they were returning all at once. Just before noon, another vehicle entered the yard. Not a pickup. Not a tractor. A county sheriff's cruiser. Sheriff Daniel Mercer stepped out carrying a brown envelope. He nodded respectfully toward Samuel. "I've been looking for you." Richard Holloway climbed from a black sedan only seconds later. He wasn't smiling anymore. Neither were the 4 men standing behind him. The spokesman marched toward the porch. "Mr. Walker, the foreclosure becomes official today." Samuel accepted the envelope from Sheriff Mercer before answering. "Does it?" The sheriff cleared his throat. "Mr. Holloway, I think you should read what arrived from the county recorder's office this morning." The banker frowned. "What is this?" "A certified review of the Walker mortgage file." Holloway unfolded the document. His confident expression slowly disappeared. The duplicate mortgage entry had been confirmed. The debt had indeed been counted twice. Every calculation used to justify foreclosure had been based on that error. Silence settled over the yard. 90 farmers watched without saying a word. The spokesman reached for the papers. Holloway pulled them back. "No." He read them again. Then a third time. "This." He swallowed. "This can't be right." Samuel finally spoke. "I told you. You hadn't finished reading. Have you ever watched certainty collapse in someone's eyes? Not because they were humiliated. Because they suddenly realized they had been defending something that wasn't true. It's a strange moment. Painful. Necessary. And sometimes it's the beginning of wisdom." Richard Holloway looked across the crowd. Dozens of farmers stood shoulder to shoulder. Old rivals. Friends. Families. Men and women who had disagreed for years over fences, drainage ditches, and property lines. Yet today they stood together. For one farm. For one family. For one principle. He had never seen anything like it. The spokesman stepped closer. "We can still challenge the report." "No," Holloway answered quietly. "We can't." "But—" "I said no." The younger man fell silent. Samuel climbed down from the porch. His boots crunched softly across frozen gravel. He stopped only a few feet from Richard Holloway. Nobody breathed. The banker looked exhausted. "I owe you an apology." Samuel nodded once. "Yes. I believed numbers more than people." Samuel looked toward the old Farmall resting beside the machine shed. "Numbers matter." "They do. But only after they're honest." Holloway followed his gaze. "That tractor." Samuel smiled. "Still working. I suppose it will for years. If someone keeps taking care of it." The banker laughed quietly. Not at Samuel. At himself. "I've spent months trying to teach farmers how farming works." Samuel's weathered face softened. "And today I realized I've never actually listened." Then something unexpected happened. Harold Benson stepped forward carrying the cigar box once more. He handed it toward Holloway. The banker looked confused. "I don't understand." Harold smiled. "You said debt should be paid." "It should. So count this." Holloway opened the box. More than $60,000 rested inside. Not from one farmer. From 90. Every family had contributed whatever they could. $20. $500. $1,000. Enough to erase the operating loan completely if necessary. Richard looked from the money to the crowd, then back to Samuel. "You were actually prepared to pay." Samuel nodded. "We always were. The paperwork just needed the truth first." Richard slowly closed the cigar box. "No." "What do you mean?" "The corrected balance is less than half this amount." He turned toward his own employees. "The foreclosure is withdrawn. Effective immediately." One employee protested. "Our investors. They'll survive." Richard looked across the assembled farmers. "I nearly destroyed something I didn't understand." Then he faced Ethan. "I can't undo what happened to your hand." "No," Ethan answered honestly. "You can't. But I can make sure nothing like this happens again." Richard extended his hand. Ethan looked at the bandages wrapped around his injured fingers. Then, using his left hand, he accepted the handshake. At that exact moment, the old Farmall M, parked quietly beside the barn, let out a deep rumble as Samuel turned the ignition key to move it into the shed before the evening frost. Every head turned. The engine settled into its familiar rhythm. Steady, patient, unshaken. Richard listened to it for several seconds before speaking again. "I finally understand why none of you wanted to sell that machine." Samuel smiled gently. "The tractor was never the lesson." Richard looked around at the 90 farmers surrounding the yard. Then he whispered almost to himself, "So what was?" No one answered Richard Holloway's question immediately. The only sound came from the steady rumble of the 1952 Farmall M, idling beside the machine shed as if it had witnessed this moment before. Thin gray exhaust drifted into the crisp November air. A flock of starlings lifted from the fence line and disappeared toward the harvested fields. Finally, Samuel Walker spoke. "The lesson," he said quietly, "is that a farm isn't worth what someone will pay for it. It's worth what a family gives to it." No one argued. Not the sheriff. Not the banker. Not the 90 neighboring farmers standing shoulder to shoulder across the frozen yard. Richard looked around at faces that only hours earlier had regarded him with suspicion. Now they simply waited. "I made a promise when I took this job," he admitted. "I told myself I'd never let emotions influence business." Samuel nodded. "That's a fine promise." Richard frowned. But farming has never been only business." Those words stayed with Richard far longer than he expected. The following Monday, November 23, 1987, the conference room inside the bank looked very different. Richard called every loan officer into the meeting. The foreclosure against Walker Farm was formally canceled. Every legal fee connected to the case was withdrawn. The duplicate mortgage entry was corrected. Then Richard did something no one expected. He ordered a complete review of every agricultural loan the bank had inherited during the merger. If one family's records contained an error, he told the staff, others might as well. Some employees complained. The review would take months. Richard ignored them. By the spring of 1988, the audit had uncovered mistakes in 12 additional farm files. Some were small. Others involved incorrect interest calculations or outdated collateral records. Every one of them was corrected before another family lost land they had spent generations building. Years later, Richard often said the most valuable education of his career had not come from business school. It had come from a gravel driveway outside Greenfield, Iowa. Ethan's hand healed slowly. The swelling disappeared before Christmas. The strength took much longer to return. For weeks, he struggled to grip fence pliers or wrap his fingers around a wrench. Some mornings the hand felt stiff enough to remind him of that November day before he even climbed out of bed. Samuel never rushed him. "You don't prove strength by pretending nothing hurts," he would say. "You prove it by showing up anyway." So Ethan did. One careful day at a time. By the following planting season, he was back behind the wheel of the old Farmall M. The steering wheel felt familiar. The engine sounded exactly as it always had. When he eased the throttle forward, the tractor answered with the same steady confidence it had carried for decades. Samuel smiled from the edge of the field. "I told you she'd wait. Let me tell you about the Farmall M1 last time. Most machines eventually become scrap. Steel rusts. Rubber cracks. Engines wear out. But every so often, one survives because somebody refuses to treat it like a disposable tool. The Walkers never restored the Farmall into a museum piece. They kept using it. Every grease fitting still received attention. Every winter the coolant was checked. Every spring the valves were adjusted. Children learned to drive on it. Grandchildren learned to respect it. It carried hay, pulled wagons, started in snowstorms, worked through muddy springs. It wasn't preserved because it was valuable. It became valuable because it was preserved. 5 years passed. Samuel turned 79. His pace slowed. His mornings began later than they once had. But he still walked through every machine shed before breakfast, resting one weathered hand on each tractor as though greeting old friends. Richard Holloway visited the farm every autumn after harvest. Not as a banker. As a guest. Sometimes he brought homemade pie baked by his wife. Sometimes he simply came to drink coffee around the kitchen table. The conversations changed over the years. Interest rates became rainfall. Loan renewals became soybean yields. Business slowly became friendship. One afternoon Richard admitted something he had never told anyone. "I almost sold this farm to an investment group." Samuel looked across the fields glowing beneath an October sunset. "I know. You knew. I figured it out. And you never hated me?" Samuel smiled. "Hate takes too much energy." Have you ever looked back on the biggest mistake of your life and realized it became the reason you finally became the person you were supposed to be? Most people never admit those moments. Richard did. And because he did, other families kept their farms. Sometimes redemption doesn't erase yesterday. It changes tomorrow. In the summer of 1998, Samuel Walker passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 85. His funeral filled the little white church outside Greenfield. Farmers parked pickups along both sides of the road for nearly half a mile. Among the pallbearers stood Harold Benson, Sheriff Daniel Mercer, and Richard Holloway. The banker who had once arrived carrying foreclosure papers now helped carry the farmer who had changed his life. After the service, Ethan walked alone into the machine shed. The Farmall M stood exactly where Samuel had left it. The key still hung from its familiar nail. Ethan climbed into the seat, turned the ignition. The old engine fired almost instantly. Its deep exhaust echoed across the empty yard. For a moment, Ethan could almost hear his father's boots crunching across the gravel. He smiled, then drove the tractor slowly toward the fields. 10 years later, Walker Farm remained in the family. Children who had once ridden beside Ethan on the tractor's steel fenders now operated modern equipment during harvest. Yet every first day of planting belonged to the old Farmall M. It wasn't the fastest tractor. It wasn't the strongest. It simply had the honor of opening another season. Visitors often asked why. Ethan always answered the same way. Every field deserves to remember who came before. Richard retired from banking in 2008. At his retirement dinner, he told a room full of young loan officers about the Walker family. He never mentioned balance sheets. He never mentioned profits. He simply said, "Before you approve a foreclosure, stand in that family's yard. If you still think you're looking at numbers instead of lives, you haven't stayed long enough." Those words became something of a legend among new agricultural lenders throughout the county. The old Farmall M still runs today. Its faded red paint carries scratches from countless seasons. Its engine still settles into the same patient rhythm. And every November, neighboring farmers gather at Walker Farm for coffee, pie, and stories about the morning 90 of them arrived without being asked. Because none of them ever forgot what happened there. Some things don't become valuable because they're expensive. They become priceless because they remind ordinary people that courage, honesty, and neighbors who stand together will always outlast fear. If this story reminded you of someone who refused to give up when everything seemed stacked against them, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. Have you ever seen neighbors come together to protect a family, a farm, or a tradition when it mattered most? Share that story below. I read every one. And if you'd like to hear about the Iowa farmer who hid his grandfather's century-old threshing machine inside an abandoned limestone quarry for 11 years rather than let it be auctioned away, I hope you'll join me for that story next.